let me go to the UK and speak to Lord Peter Hain, who was a staunch anti-apartheid activist, used a form of militant protests to get the word out of the atrocities in South Africa and advocate for change. Lord Peter Hain, now a British Labour Lord, last week he broke party ranks by voting against the UK government's banning of an activist group. It's called Palestine Action. They were included on a list of proscribed organizations. And what Palestine Action did is that they sabotaged two Royal Air Force Voyager planes reportedly linked to Israeli airstrikes in Gaza. It caused something like almost 10 million US dollars in damage. And now Palestine Action has been proscribed as a designated terror group. The bill was passed through the House of Commons and the House of Lords, a vote in which Peter Hain voted against. He later said he was deeply ashamed of the UK's Labour government. He joins me now. Good morning, Lord Peter Hain. Really appreciate your time. You said you're deeply ashamed. Was this about the policy itself, the Labour Party's direction, or maybe something deeper in Britain's current political climate? Peter, good morning.
Well, I was ashamed and I did vote against the government, which is not something I normally ever do, because I thought the policy of prescribing Palestine Action, not an organization, by the way, that I've ever appeared on a platform for or at any of its activities, but that's not the point. If you engage in protest, including the one you mentioned about spraying paint on some military aircraft, which, by the way, the authorities said were never used in Israel or in Gaza or in any way connected with it, but that's by the way. I thought that that policy was intellectually bankrupt, politically unprincipled, and morally wrong, and that's why I did feel ashamed, because what it was doing is conflating, in I think a very dangerous way, protest with terrorism. Now, terrorism, by definition, is directed at innocent bystanders, the sort of thing that Al Qaeda did in 2001, in September the 9th, 2001. Sorry, September the 11th, 2001, when they rammed those two airliners into the Twin Towers in New York, killing thousands of people, nearly 3,000 people. Or Islamic State, and you'll remember in their heyday when they were spreading fear and panic by bombing and attacking innocent bystanders in order to gain attention and punish any groups that they felt were in their way. And of course, they beheaded people opposing them, filmed those executions, and engaged in widespread sexual slavery, particularly of Yazidi women. And then Islamic State also killed hundreds of bystanders in Paris, in Brussels, Istanbul, and in Sri Lanka. Now, I think that's real terrorism, real terrorists, and they deserve to be prescribed. But protests against what Israel is doing in Gaza, for example, which is what has been going on there, has been terrible. Protests against that by Palestine Action, in my view, should not be designated as terrorists. And I made some historic comparisons with Nelson Mandela being labeled a terrorist, and also with the suffragettes, women in Britain fighting for the vote, campaigning for the vote that women didn't have in the early part of the last century. They took all sorts of militant action as well. But under this kind of prescription, they would have been designated terrorists, as would I have been for running on the pitch and stopping all white racist South African Springbok and cricketers.
Yeah, so with your context of knowing the South African context and the world's response to South Africa, how do you currently see Western governments' continued support of Israel? And if I look at the latest death toll coming out of Gaza, 57,500 people. The death toll passed 57,500, 17 hours ago. How do you see the continued Western support and the allyship of Israel? Well, that stark number, 57,000, with
Well, many people in South Africa who I've spoken to, friends and others, say that this is hypocritical, that we are condoning, whether it's from London or New York or Washington, D.C. or elsewhere, condoning action by the Israeli government against Palestinians in Gaza, which is of a kind that we then condemn other people for. Now, I'm a supporter of the right of Israel to exist, and some of my friends don't seem to believe in that. And I think there's a group of people in South Africa who don't believe that either. I do support the right of um, Israelis to exist and to exist of Israel to exist and Israeli citizens to enjoy peace and security. But I also am a long-standing supporter of Palestinian self-determination and their right to have their own independent state. And there's a kind of a sort of position in the international community, which you asked me about, that says it believes in a two-state solution, as I do and have long done, including when I was UK Minister for the Middle East. In other words, an Israeli state enjoying security from attacks of all sorts of kinds, alongside an independent Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank, also enjoying peace and security. But that's becoming increasingly difficult to imagine or foresee or think that that could come into being because Prime Minister Netanyahu has and his extreme right-wing government have said they don't believe in that two-state solution anymore. And the way that Gaza has been reduced to rubble and the way that illegal settlements illegal under international law are being spread all over the West Bank makes me wonder whether the objective of Netanyahu really is to drive the Palestinians out of their
Mm,
land and to take it over and occupy it. And so I think that whether it's South Africans or other people in the global
mm,
South look at this and they say, you're inviting us to condemn President Putin for his attack on Ukraine. And I do condemn him. I'm totally opposed to Russian barbarism in Ukraine. I think that's a sort of imperialist venture of the kind that lots of people in Africa suffered from during colonialism. But I also understand why people say, you're asking us to oppose Putin attacking Ukrainians, and then you don't do anything about Israel attacking
yeah.
Palestinians.
Peter,
So I think that's what.
I want to just finally focus on, as someone who has been an anti-apartheid campaigner and with your involvement in British politics, but also your reflections on the role of culture and sport. And I look at 1988, the concert for Nelson Mandela at Wembley. You look at sport boycotts, and only much later comes the political movement for change. Are you seeing something similar? Are there any comparisons to late stage South African apartheid and how the world culturally, there's been some rumblings of whether sporting sanctions then become, we've already have individual teams who say they will not play Israel in any sporting code. No word from the major sporting bodies. But do you see any similarities on how the world, particularly the West, changed on a dime mid to late 1980s, led by sport and culture and then political, to what we're seeing in respect to the Palestine issue at the moment?
Well, look, I was brought up in Pretoria. I spent my childhood there, the proud son of anti-apartheid, of white anti-apartheid activists, and they were both jailed and banned and forced to leave the country. And I went with them into exile and our family into exile in 1966. And at that time and throughout apartheid, sport was organized on a uniquely racist basis. I couldn't play as a Pretoria schoolboy against anybody who wasn't white or with anybody who wasn't white in organized sports. I had to go to a whites only school, and we played other whites only schools at cricket and rugby and soccer. So sport from top to bottom, from school level through club level to national level, where you could only represent your country, whether it's the Springboks or other national teams if you were white. That was a uniquely racist system. Israel doesn't have that sporting uh, character. Its sports system is not organized on that institutional racist basis that apartheid meant for every nook and cranny of life in South Africa during those dark years. And I protested against that in sport. But you know, when countries or teams say, "Look, we can't play Israel because of what it's doing in Gaza," that for me is equivalent to saying you can't play Russian teams or excluding Russian teams because of their barbarous attack on Ukraine. It's not the same as apartheid, where the actual sports system was intrinsically political. Its character was organized on a basis where it was illegal, or certainly you couldn't represent your country if you weren't white. I mean, that's not the case in Israel, so it's a different situation. And I think it's really important to separate the two because otherwise you get into a situation where
But
you don't have any
very
sport.
fine in
Uh,
60 seconds. I'm very late for news, but generally the tone of organizations, particularly from politics, are you sensing a change in a turn to how Western countries respond to Israel, with now 57,000 people being killed in Gaza over the last 2 years?
Well, I think there's an element of denial here, and I'm very worried about it. I don't actually think it's in Israel's interest to have continual warfare like this. But getting back to the question you started on, which is why did I vote against my own government for prescribing this organization, Palestine Action? 2 days after that vote in the House of Lords, and my rebellion on it, because I was very worried for the reasons I explained, an 83-year-old retired priest was arrested for terrorism because she was on a
Mm,
Palestine Action protest in
mm,
Parliament Square, putting up a placard very peacefully saying that she was opposed to what was
yeah.
being done in Gaza.
Mm. Peter Hain, really apologize for cutting you off there, but thank you so much. Very, very late for news. Lord Peter Hain, British Labour Lord.